So without further ado, it's really a great pleasure to introduce my colleagues Arthur Kleinman and Paul Farmer. Arthur Kleinman is the Esther and Sidney Rabb Professor of Anthropology, Professor of Medical Anthropology in Social Medicine, Professor of Psychiatry in the Harvard Medical School, and the Victor and William Fung Director of Harvard University's Asia Center and a Harvard College professor, as well as the former chair of this department, the Department of Anthropology. He's now in his 39th year here at Harvard and was trained in anthropology and psychiatry at Stanford, Harvard, and MGH. He's a leading figure in several fields, including medical anthropology, cultural psychology, global health, social medicine, and medical humanities. Although his impact is profound and broad, his primary focus of fieldwork has been in China, where he's been working since 1978. For more than 30 years, his publications have shaped and defined the discipline of medical anthropology, starting with his groundbreaking work, Patients and Healers in the Context of Culture, followed by Social Origins of Distress and Disease, Depression, Neurasthenia, and Condition, Social Origins of Distress and Disease, Rethinking Psychiatry from Cultural Category to Personal Experience, Writing at the Margin, What Really Matters, and on, a large number of books that he's both authored himself and edited with other authors, as well as over 300 articles in journals and edited books. These works deal with the questions of social suffering, mental health, stigma, subjectivity, moral experience, and caregiving. He's a member of the Institute of Medicine and the National Academy of Science and American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Recipient of fellowships and honorary professorships too numerous to count, and scores of major research grants. He's a profoundly important member of our department and our discipline, and it's a great pleasure to have him here today. Paul Farmer is a physician and anthropologist, chief strategist and co-founder of Partners in Health, and the Kola Kotronis University professor and chair of the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at Harvard Medical School, where he served as the chief of the Division of Global Health Equity at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston and the university professor since 2010. He also serves as UN Special Advisor to Secretary General on community-based medicine and lessons from Haiti. He was trained in anthropology and medicine at Duke University and Harvard, and at Harvard with Professor Kleinman, and is known for his humanitarian work providing suitable health care for rural and under-resourced areas in developing countries. Dr. Farmer has written extensively on health, human rights, and the consequences of social inequality. His most recent books are In the Company of the Poor, Conversations with Paul Farmer, and Father Gustavo Gutierrez, Reimagining Global Health, an Introduction, and To Repair the World, Paul Farmer Speaks to the Next Generation. Others of his titles include Partner to the Poor, a Paul Farmer Reader, Pathologies of Power, Infections and Inequalities, The Uses of Haiti, and AIDS and Accusation. In addition, Dr. Farmer is co-editor of Women, Poverty, and AIDS, The Global Impact of Drug-Resistant Tuberculosis, and Global Health in Times of Violence, as well as being the subject of a book called Mountains and Beyond Mountains, The Quest of Dr. Paul Farmer, a Man Who Could Cure the World by Pulitzer Prize-winning author Tracy Kidder, which describes his work in Haiti, Peru, and Russia. Recently, particularly during the 2014 Ebola outbreak, Dr. Farmer and Partners in Health were involved in the healthcare response in Liberia, speaking out in terms of, in many forums, about the roles of poverty in healthcare delivery systems in the spread of that disease. Professor Farmer has been the recipient of numerous awards, including the Margaret Mead Award from the American Anthropological Association, the American Medical Association's Outstanding International Physician Award, and a MacArthur Fellowship. And with his Partners in Health colleagues, the Hilton Humanitarian Prize. He's a member of the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy of Sciences and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences as well. And also, as I discovered when doing some research, his birthday is next Monday, October 26th, the day before mine. So it was
birthday.
nice to find out.
29
well.
still?
Yeah, I'm 29.
So with that short-ish introduction, I'm very happy to have Professors Kleinman and Farmer with us today, and I'm going to turn the conversation over to them.
Great.
Join me in welcoming them, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Rowan and Ramiar, and thank you to all of you who've come. You know, Paul and I are going to have a very relaxed conversation, and we want you to be part of this. We've been having conversations for a long time. I brought some
This is a bad sign.
I brought some materials that my assistant found in our files. These are letters.
Linda, you traitor.
These are from the handwritten days of letters from the early 1980s, 1980, 1981, from a young student at Duke who dared to ask me if he could become a medical anthropologist like me and do the things I was doing. And here, years later, we've gone from in the following way. We've started as a freshman and a professor. We then went to an advisor and a PhD student. We then went to a young professor and a department chair. Then we became equals as professors. Then he became a university professor and my department chair in my side in the medical school.
So remember, always be nice to your students.
Always be nice. And we have a relationship that I think is probably only possible to describe as father and son. And I think that no one could be more proud than me of having a second son in Paul. I already have a first son in my son Peter. And I hope he has the same pride. But today we wanted to do this in a way that's both relaxed and friendly and about ourselves and yet about an important topic. And it's not by happenstance that Paul and I are anthropologists, nor is it secondary to the fact that we're also physicians and do global health. Anthropology is central, and we want you to understand why it's central and why we think it should be central to you. And I'm going to start and turn things over to Paul and just simply say that anthropology liberated me. It liberated me from an overly narrow perspective on the world, from a too medico-centric perspective on the world, and it gave me enormous breadth and a sense of freedom of interests. In addition, it did a couple of other things. I remember when, years ago, in 1980, I won a prize from the Brits, which this guy also won, called the Welcome Medal. And when I went to receive it in Edinburgh, there was a very famous British anthropologist called Raymond Firth. And Raymond told me that the reason that anthropology was important was that it asked the big questions. It asked the big questions. And I think if you look around, that's one of the reasons it still is important. It asks very fundamental questions about life, about meaning, about the way the world is organized, about the way medicine works, about people's experiences, about structural violence, about all those things that have come to dominate, actually, the conversations that Paul and I have. But it's also important because it gives authority of some sort to local knowledge in a world in which we're dominated by global studies. And what makes our backgrounds interesting is that within our bodies, within ourselves, we both have local attention to local knowledge and concern for global studies. So the tension between the two, somehow authorizing and bringing into account local knowledge and practices, but also global interests, I think is right there between us and speaks to why anthropology is important for health and medicine. And the last thing I'll say before turning things over is that there's something remarkable, as you'll find out if you really get into anthropology, about the ethnographic method. It's a method that produces not just knowledge, but actually wisdom. And it's wisdom not just about the world, but for yourself. Because it alienates you to some degree from the taken for granted world which we get socialized into and which dominates us. It opens us up to very different worlds. It brings a critical reflection to bear on that comparison between the two. And it makes lived experience the basis for asking big questions and dealing with theories. Nothing could, I think, in the course of a life be more satisfying than taking that and applying it in a field like clinical medicine or global health. And with having said that as sort of introduction, let me turn to Paul. And what I'm going to do is after Paul speaks, we're going to have a conversation back and forth about things. Paul.
Well, first of all, thank you. And I will say, not to be outdone by my mentor, that yes, the feeling is reciprocated. And that, as the years go by, and many of you are taking the class that we teach together, and the we there are 4 physician anthropologists, and 3 of us are students of Arthur's, Salman Khashoggi and Becker, my contemporary, and I'm the 3rd one, right? Let me just, riffing a little bit off of what Arthur said, and I also want to say it's so great to be here. This is not, I'm not doing you a favor. I've been excited about this ever since Arthur reminded me yesterday that we were doing it. He said, so tomorrow we're doing this, and I went, right. But riffing off of what Arthur said, his words were, anthropology liberated him from a overly narrow biomedical view. Well, I was lucky enough to be his student and the student of anthropology early enough so that I didn't need liberation from that. I was already committed to medicine and social anthropology, clinical medicine, social anthropology, by the time I finished college. And that letter that I wrote him, which I'm a little horrified, even my handwriting looks puerile, and I'm sure that the prose is entirely pretentious and embarrassing. So thank you for not reading it out loud. In 1980, I took a class called medical anthropology because I wanted to be a doctor. So I took medical ethics, anything with the word medical in it. I was a biochemistry major and liked biochemistry. And then I took this class. And in fact, I don't think that Patients and Healers was out then. Arthur's first book, it was in proofs. And how Atwood Gaines obtained the proofs, I'm not sure. Now I would ask, hey, where'd you get the, sweet, as you guys say, these sweet proofs? You're supposed to laugh a little bit. And I wrote to Professor Kleinman, who was then at the University of Washington, and to my great delight and instruction, meaning I learned a lot about how to be a good teacher. I hope I'm a good teacher, from Arthur. Now back to the liberation part. Having, embraced wholly this perspective by the time I was 21, in fact, I was a complete convert, and like a lot of converts, probably overly zealous in those years. I changed my major at an annoyingly late stage of my undergraduate career to anthropology. And biochemistry became my minor, I guess is the term. And afterwards, I headed off to Haiti, and more about that in our conversation. But so I really went into medical school and then residency and actually very subspecialist training in infectious disease, already freed from any kind of overly narrow way of seeing things. And as Arthur said, and I think this is worth mastering as your own. That's what we try to do in our undergraduate teaching. In fact, help people try on new ways of seeing problems and talking about them, just quite openly. Years ago, we said, well, really, it's undergraduates and graduate students are trying out new ideas between each other, with us, in a section, learning how to talk about these complex problems in a new way. And it's a new way not because we reject subspecialist knowledge. I'm an infectious disease physician, and in fact, even though I have that title as, that's the longest title that a UN Undersecretary General, by the way, I get paid $2 a year for that, which I thought was $1 a year, and then someone in the UN corrected me and said it was $2. And I keep looking for that check, one of those big giant checks with $2.00 written on it. But it says something about community-based medicine. I much prefer actually hospital-based medicine. But that's what I prefer. That's not what most people need in the course of their life. They need caregivers at home to be recognized, as I'm sure Arthur will discuss, and to be able to receive care for chronic disease in their homes and neighborhoods, not to have to come into a clinic, much less a hospital, for a flu shot or to have their blood sugars checked if they're diabetic, et cetera. Now, again, back to liberation, when I began working, and I'll put quotation marks around work because I think it was many years before my efforts and those of many others added up to much. When you're a young person, that's not how you tell the story about yourself, right? You exaggerate your own efficacy. And again, I hope in this conversation you won't feel the need to do that, but I know I did. Completely exaggerated the significance of our work. And that's not as something dishonest. It was internal. I exaggerated in my own head the significance of this work. But one thing I know that we did right, and was the fruit of having studied and then studying formally anthropology and clinical medicine, was to understand how large-scale social forces like poverty, like racism, like gender inequality, like disruptions that happened many years ago and sometimes centuries ago, how those came to be embodied. So he may have had to learn that again after he already finished his medical training, which included medical school, then psychiatry residency, then subspecialist training. But I got to learn it from the beginning. And that's kind of my main message is it's hard for me to imagine any field of inquiry or personal engagement that would not be illuminated by, and as Arthur said, improved by anthropology. I can't imagine any. Law, being a professor of molecular biology, I'm just making this stuff up now. And again, finance, business fields that are really not that well known to either of us, because we've been all our lives academic physicians, or all of our adult lives. But it's really hard for me to imagine. It's about that local moral world, as Arthur has said, that is a family, a village. I worked in village Haiti, and then rural Rwanda, Malawi, Lesotho, or a prison. I've worked in Siberian prisons, Rwandan prisons. There is a local moral world. And here's one thing I think that anthropologists did not get right back in the early years of the discipline in the late 19th and maybe the first half of the 20th century. Often there was plenty of knowledge of the local moral worlds, the arcana of everyday life, especially around ritual, cosmology, kinship. There's a small list. It's not endless. But there was a very common error of not connecting that to the large-scale social and historical forces, many of them economic, that could not be seen in the course of ethnographic study. If you're sitting in a village in, let's say, eastern Sierra Leone or Liberia, near the forest, you will see with your own eyes, you will see families that live out often short lives, and they're, in my experience, again, I don't know why I mentioned that place, I'm working on a book about it. It's not the place I know ethnographically, but they'll tell you all about cosmology, kinship, who's related to whom, but you won't see the impact of, let me just make a list, policies around structural adjustment, the diamond trade in the neighboring country, the impact of the wars that ended in that region 15 years ago, and then the enduring impact of not only the slave trade, right, which ended formally. You'd be surprised how late it ended. The British abolished slave trade, while we're talking about Sierra Leone, in something like 1806. But it wasn't abolished in the colony and protectorate of Sierra Leone until the 1930s.
Wow.
So this is not, that you can't see that, you know, in your ethnographic field work, and you can't see it in the clinic either. You know, people don't parade their historical memories and injuries in, you know, everyday conversation or in clinic, you know, inside when they're sick, but it's there, and that's, and anthropology in the latter part of the 20th century, I think, stopped making that error, and you'd find, I think you'd be hard pressed to find people who thought it was, anthropologists who thought it was okay to only understand the ethnographically visible. They're also, in my experience as a reader and a colleague, very attentive to history, political economy, and other fields that are outside anthropology. All this to say as a plug for anthropology, again, I can think of no arena of personal and professional life that could not be illuminated by anthropology, and it is a discipline that is open to other disciplines, especially in recent decades. And those are two reasons I think that anthropology matter. That's an old school Enlightenment idea, by the way, that if you understand something better, you can better intervene. I buy that completely. Another is that it takes time to understand not only other people's lives, but your own life, you know, and your own way of understanding your work. So is that a solid pitch for the discipline? Because I'm a true believer.
So you're hearing our perspective meant to encourage you to think about your own life in this context. Let's sort of complete this before we open it up by giving you a sense of how it affected our own lives. So I did my first bout of field work in 1969, from 1969 to 1970 in Taipei, Taiwan, in urban, as opposed to Paul, I've worked mostly in urban settings. And then in 75, again in Taiwan, in an urban setting in Taipei. 1978 in a provincial capital in the center of China, Changsha, Hunan. And then in the 80s, increasingly in Shanghai, Beijing, and all over the place in China. And my engagement as an anthropologist with Chinese materials was much more than just an academic exercise or even an applied exercise. It actually came to inform my life as my values. My values probably represent Neo-Confucian thought and the way Chinese traditionally raised families as much as anything that came out of my own personal family and background. My late wife, who died 4 years ago, was a China scholar. We raised our kids with a strong understanding of what was at stake in the world, coming out of the Chinese tradition. And in my own innermost sense, my sense of self very much resonates with images and voices out of the Chinese tradition. In the course of doing these things, once in field work in 1980, I got very sick. In 1980,
That's because you hadn't trained me as a doctor yet.
it was actually
I would have taken care of
in his area. I got very sick, and I was in Changsha, Hunan, for 6 months, and then in the last few weeks, the last 3 weeks, my wife and 2 kids left the field, and I developed a GI problem, and which later turned out to be what was called non-tropical sprue, and in a period of 4 weeks, lost 20% of my body weight, which is a substantial amount of your body weight. And when some of my Chinese colleagues thought that I wouldn't make it coming out of this, and when I remember boarding the plane from Shanghai to San Francisco, I believe, via Tokyo, and I noticed that I could never cinch my belt, even when I got to the tightest level. It couldn't keep my pants up, so I had to walk around with my hand holding my pants up. And I came to terms at that moment with, was the field work worth it? Was it worth the fact that I had gotten so sick and it took me a while to recover? And my answer was, yeah, it was really worth it. I had had an incredible set of field experiences that was the first study by an outsider of people going through the Cultural Revolution, of what their experiences were like in a period of political chaos and of tremendous political pressure, in which what Paul just talked about, the large-scale forces came right down into families and broke people's lives. And to engage people and see the consequences, to be a witness to that, was not just an incredible privilege, but began to inform me about what was important in my life, what I wanted to take away from that. And the reason I emphasize getting sick in the field is not that you'll get sick in the field.
Please don't.
Most of you won't, and you'll do very well. But it's also how we live as anthropologists in the field. We don't live in five-star hotels. We don't live.
Well, I have a confession. No, I'm kidding.
Today you may stay in a five-star hotel, but we live on the ground with people. Life is with people, and being in that setting with people, I think, is extremely important. I think that's where the give and take, the engagement with language is so important. Paul is absolutely fluent in Creole. He has beautiful French. In fact, let me just tell a side story here. I'll mark for myself. I once had the privilege of watching Paul when he was a professor at the Collège de France in Paris give a lecture, a public lecture. It was wintertime in Paris, and the Collège de France is a very, very prestigious, high-ranking institution, and its lectures are open to the public. And the public that actually takes advantage of its lectures is not the middle class and not the well-to-do, but it's poor people, including the homeless, who come into a warm building, and there's going to be a reception afterward, and they lie down on the benches in the first few rows, sometimes look up at the speaker, but often start snoring, and you can see that they've been out without sleep. And I had the experience of watching Paul go through this in a lecture in which he lectured as if the room were filled with faces of people attentive, as opposed to people who had come in to get out of the cold. But anyway, the thought I had in mind here was this engagement through language with people. Language does something with you. You watch your personality when you speak another language, and it changes. Your engagement with others becomes different. A part of you connects with them in a certain kind of way. There's a wonderful Chinese phrase for this. It's called 知音, to hear the tone, to hear the tone. It's not just the words, not just the content. It's you actually get into the tone of what a life is like. What is that about? That's the embodiment of culture. That's how culture works. That's what anthropology is about. It's about that kind of engagement.
You know, to add something, again, pick up on what you said, you know, I think there is much to be recommended by the fairly traditional approach to anthropology, which is ethnographic fieldwork and competence in, you know, another language. And that's really, that something happens to, I mean, again, for Chinese, you have to learn an entirely different, you know, way of conveying language. You know, Haitian Creole is not a tonal language. And, you know, it's, so especially for a French speaker, the complexity is entirely different, but that process happens nonetheless, and it's quite profound. There's another thing that I hope you will find reassuring if you're not going to go off, you know, and master several different languages. And that is that you can learn from anthropology that cultural, in medical school, in many medical schools, and I got to be somewhat diplomatic here since we're being taped, there is the somewhat absurd notion that we could be culturally competent, that you can just pick up cultural competence. Now, why is that absurd? To try and teach young physicians, and I suppose nurses, although Harvard doesn't have a nursing school, that they could aspire to cultural competence, I think is a mistake. It's much better to teach them to aspire to cultural humility, right? Because once you learn another language and pay attention to the history, because that doesn't come automatically, understanding history automatically. Like I said, you can't even pick that up in ethnographic work, only the whispers and trails of prior events or far off events that have really marked a place. You have to study, you have to work, you have to be scholarly. The transformation that ensues from that kind of investment, learning a language, living with people and not apart from them, and really pouring your all into understanding another culture. Go ahead and call it that, I think that's fine. That's transformative. Everybody should be so lucky to do it, right? Again, whether you're a lawyer or a physician or or administrator, it doesn't, anything can be illuminated by it. However, it also teaches you that it's very difficult to claim cultural competence, or as often you hear the term competency, cultural competency, cultural competence. So after 10 years of field work and in Haiti, again, the language wasn't that difficult, you're still, I was still learning. Now I'm 30-something years in. I'm still learning things about Haiti. And things about the Haitian culture, history, local moral worlds. Again, every time you get to know another patient, you can know another family, and they have their own distinct experience. You can't just say, oh, well, they're Haitian, therefore, here's the template. So what is that? I think that's cultural humility. And I say that because not all of my experience has any kind of depth, linguistically or culturally. I work very happily in Rwanda, and some of my colleagues from Rwanda and Haiti are here tonight. In Russia, I don't speak Russian, much less do I speak felon speak. I work in prisons, but I work as a physician who understands very well the sharp limitations of his cultural knowledge. And that kind of cultural humility, I think, instead of cultural arrogance, which does us all a disservice, or even the somewhat innocent sounding liberal notion of cultural competency, which I think also does us a disservice, we can learn cultural humility from anthropology. Yeah. Because it's humbling how after 20, 30 years, I imagine Arthur can never in his lifetime plumb the depths of Chinese cultures and Chinese histories. And we know it. We know this about ourselves. And that's another wonderful thing to learn earlier than I did.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, I think it's time to sort of open it up and ask for questions, and we'll respond to questions.
We have a microphone. Can you please step up to the microphone?
Yeah, come on up. Come on up here. Don't hesitate to come up, because the more relaxed you are, the more relaxed we'll be. The more.
For the sake of the recording.
Come on, Hannah.
Yeah.
Don't be shy.
Yeah, come on. Yeah, come on.
Hi, my name is Hannah. Hello. So I was wondering, in terms of, the globalization of the world as we know it, and there's just this really famous narrative when Steve Jobs goes to Turkey and he's like, well, it doesn't matter that they have this special way of making coffee because everyone's wearing Gap jeans and like all these things like in the United States. And so when you have this, this like increasingly, I guess, like superficially similar culture that's like becoming, propagated all over the world, what does that do to like the cultures that were there before? Do you anticipate a hybridization of these cultures, or do you think like slowly things will become erased as time goes on?
That's a great question, and if you don't mind, let me start.
Please.
And this is where I think anthropology is incredibly relevant. The world I was born into and socialized was the 1940s and 50s. It's gone forever. It's gone forever. This is American society is a incredibly different society than the world that I was socialized into. But just think of what that means. Now I'm in my 8th decade, so all of us who are, let's say, in the 6th, 7th, 8th decades in this country, which makes up about 20% of the population, we're living in a world that's completely different than the world we were socialized into. Okay? You guys are the most connected of all generations. And when I say you guys, I don't just mean those of you who come from the United States. I mean those of you from all over the world. So this is true of people from India, from China, from Latin America, from Africa. There's incredible connectivity, that is, excepting those who are so impoverished that they don't have access to the internet or to television or to the other things that connect us. So to begin with, the question I want to ask anthropologically is, that must make your generation really different than my generation, And how do we come to terms in understanding that? I think we understand that through things like music and art. These are aspects of anthropology that are hugely important. Music and art. Music is something about your generation and music, and each generation with its engagement with music and with forms of art, I think begins to see different ways of living, different lifestyles, our engagements with the world differently. So there may be superficial similarities. We may all wear some clothes that seem the same, but the enormous difference is you don't even have to leave the borders of Boston to see those differences. And they're generational, they're age cohort, they're class related, they're ethnic background related, and they're very much tied to changes in our subjectivity. So that it just gives me a second to say that I'm engaged for the first time in my life in a project with a contemporary artist. His name is Wolfgang Tillmans, and he's a great photographer. His work is right now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City and at the Zverna Gallery in Chelsea in New York. He's a great photographer, and we're doing a project on caregiving, on spaces of caregiving. And the ideas that I've had about caregiving have been very much academical ideas. The ideas he has about caregiving are aesthetical ideas. They're ideas having to do with the way that space represents coherence or fragmentation or a difference or beauty, etc. And the roles that plays in who people are and the like. So that difference, the question of difference and also of similarity becomes central to anthropology. Difference in the sense of how our lives different, how our subjectivity is different, how is our sensibility different. And similarities is in that setting of difference is enormously significant. And this is what makes medical anthropology so great, I think, is that it asks the question of existential similarities in the setting of cultural and historical difference. There are only a limited number of ways of being human in the world, and suffering and caregiving are crucial ways of being human all over the world, yet they're done differently, they're experienced differently. From the sensations of an illness, to the labeling of a disease, to the care that's provided, you see both those differences and extraordinary similarities. Now, anthropology has had trouble at times in this era, in a contemporary era, engaging the idea of existential universals, because the emphasis has been so great on difference. And one of the remarkable things about medical anthropology is that it forces anthropology to engage not just difference, as it does so well, but existential universals. Paul.
I think it's a great and vexing question. And the good news is that in spite of what is, if Steve Jobs could see similarity and made something of it, right? We always see particularity. and specificity. And there's a trap there, as Arthur said, just to add to we also all live in bodies, There is probably an anthropologist would call their own sin, our own sins, the fetishization of difference, the reification, the exaggeration of cultural difference to the exclusion of what? Well, we all live in bodies. If I look at a chest x-ray in a Russian prison, a squatter settlement in Rwanda, or in a Boston teaching hospital, I can read them in all three places, And so there is, we don't want to, in medical anthropology, it becomes harder to forget that people all live in bodies. And, it's not that the body isn't socially constructed in some way or that things aren't embodied, right? Today I took an Uber, I'm confessing, and as an Egyptian driver, and he, within 10 minutes, was telling me his whole medical history, but also that, usually it's 5 minutes, by the way, but usually, and also how the social world he practically said how the social world gets in my body. He practically said it. Meaning the stresses of his life, are his kids okay? Did he have insurance? He told me about his wisdom tooth. We're just getting onto his hypertension. He showed me a picture of the tea he drank that was made out of hibiscus.
Was he looking at the road during this?
Yeah, he was driving, and I was like, and my point is just that, there was plenty I had to say to him, because I knew, we do live in bodies. And another is, again, this is kind of on the one side, first of all, the appreciation of specificity and detail. There's nothing wrong with that, right? And personal experience. And let me tell you, I've been reading these ethnographies of West Africa, and even the hard-bitten ones, Accountable History and Political Economy, are still full of dizzying detail about a fairly small list of subjects, including almost always kinship. Again, I could go through ritual, cosmology. I happen to be interested in those. I don't think you can really overdo it. If you don't like that detail, just shut the book, right? And go look on your Apple device at gap close, right? But there are also other ways of, poverty, extreme poverty, food insecurity, and violence lead, along with severe illness, to suffering. There's experience in different ways, but that doesn't mean that there is not this bedrock. And anthropologists have quarreled about this for now soon 2 centuries. Is there a bedrock?
Yeah.
Is there a bedrock of having your lung taken out by a bullet? Yeah, there is. Of exsanguinating. So this argument, and it gets very complicated around the social construction of gender inequality, rights, et cetera. We're all very interested in that. But there are things that you can hold on to, even as you explore the particularity of personal experience and of living in another language. And then just one little example, Hannah. Again, I'm reading these West African ethnographies, is the cosmopolitanism that you describe and that Steve Jobs diagnosed in a visit to Istanbul, which, by the way, struck me in a very different way. I go in and out of there all the time. It's, how different it is from every place that I've been. I go there just to look at how, and just to look at how different it seems. How about that? And beautiful. And, I get a kind of a sense of strangeness that I would never get in Rwanda, Haiti, or Boston, right? No. So where he saw similarity and a good trade opportunity, I see difference. But, the cosmopolitanism that you're describing, for many historically minded anthropologists, certainly those who work in West Africa or Haiti, was well underway by the late 15th century. These 2 parts of the world where I have worked most, or am starting to work, and have worked for over 30 years, have been caught up in this mesh of cosmopolitan, the world, and again, There are a series of analytic models that have fallen out of favor, but are instructive nonetheless. World systems theory, it's an astounding history, the history of colonial and really pre-colonial exchange. You heard about some of this in our class, SW25. If 90% of the indigenous population of Central America, the Caribbean, was wiped out within a century, and very substantially along the eastern seaboard where we're sitting now, then it can't be new, right, to be caught up in this cosmopolitan, meaning world culture, and the particularities were there too. And I don't want to exaggerate the fact that there's nothing new under the sun, or the connectivity is astounding. You don't have to take a ship, whether as a captive or a captain. You don't have to take a ship for 2 months to get from West Africa to Harvard. I commuted last fall, as Arthur will tell you, during the Ebola crisis. I could literally come back Sunday afternoon, teach a course with the March of Sen on Monday, a seminar, and be back on a plane by Monday night, and in rural
Now, wait a minute, what
Sierra
about the
Leone.
21 days of
Quarantine?
quarantine?
All right, I'm going on and on. I'm just saying these polls, we're just getting warmed up, so don't try and shut us off.
I was going to grab the mic in case people had questions.
Yeah.
You see why we were excited about this? All right, well, I'll strive for concision.
This will be a brief question.
Yeah.
So I know for Dr. Kleinman, I think anthropology as a field study was more of a liberating thing.
Yeah.
And I guess a lot of us in the room perhaps may not already have decided as anthropology to be our major. I mean, I'm like a chemical and physical biology major right now, but I'm really interested in anthropology. And I guess outside of that one course you took in medical anthropology, is there anything else that I guess persuaded you to pursue that field further? And do you have any tips for other students who are perhaps looking for more ways to get into medical anthropology?
Well, I'll go back to that experience since it involved Arthur already, right? Reading his work, I thought, that's kind of what I want. Not kind of, that's what I want to do. In fact, I'm sure there's abundant documentation in his files that I said goofy things like that. And Cameron, you can feel free to say goofy things like that to me, all right? But it's not goofy at all, of course, wanting to, emulating someone. I think it's a great thing. I emulated Arthur, I would say it right here. And the other things that I would do, and I think that really swayed me, was in this particular course, which again was called medical anthropology. It's probably the first medical anthropology taught at Duke, right, 1980. There weren't that many courses being taught then, I would imagine. Is that correct?
I don't know, did Weston LaBar teach?
He taught psychological anthropology, but this was just called medical anthropology. In any case, it was required that we do field work for the class. Now, we don't do that in our undergraduate classes, but it was a great experience. And I did mine in the emergency room at Duke University Medical Center, where I learned a lot about race, class, and gender, which, let's just say, hadn't come up in the course of my biochemistry work, right? So do that, and it doesn't matter. And a third thing you can do is write. You can write for us or other professors. I wrote for student publications, would recommend it. So that's 3 things. 1, take classes, and take classes widely. And that's why you're in a liberal arts college. 2, do something, that is outside the classroom that is still going to be formally instructive to you. I called it field work, and we had the pretense and pretension to call it field work even then, 20 years old. And then I went to work more, not work, again, quotation marks, to investigate other things much more deeply, which became the subject of our ongoing conversation, involving Haitians, migrant farm workers. Again, the political economy of labor has been a lifelong fascination for me. And third, try these things out. We mentioned writing because we both love writing, but we also, as you can tell, love talking, including to each other.
I'd like to eat good meals together.
And we like to eat good meals
And
together.
have a glass of wine. No.
So those are 3 things that you can do. You can't have a glass of wine unless you're of age.
Let me just, can I just jump on just for a second on this? One of the things that anthropology does that we try to bring forward in the global health course, SW25, but you'll get more of in other courses in the department, is that a lot of anthropology today is about the anthropology of science and technology. And to be able to see science both as something that you can do in the laboratory, as one of our senior students is doing this year, and at the same time step away from the laboratory and ask basic questions about the social construction of that science and the social consequences and the values built into that science. That's an incredible opportunity.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Margot. I'm taking your SW25 class, but
You
this
enjoying
is,
it?
I'm enjoying it immensely.
Great.
This is a question that I've been thinking a lot about in the context of medical anthropology, but I think you can extend to the whole field of anthropology. How to negotiate keeping yourself open and sensible of other people's sufferings, but also making sure that doesn't impede your academic study and your ability to advocate on behalf of those people, how to negotiate.
Yeah, now let me just say, let me start this one off. I think this is a great question. And I once felt that Woody Allen had spoofed me on this one. I'll tell you why. I gave a lecture once to a lot of people in Australia. And at the end, I gave it about what a good doctor is about, how anthropological knowledge can make a doctor a better doctor. And I talked about the importance of respecting people and listening to their narrative and engaging them where they are in their worlds around their sickness experience. And then I met a physician who, as I said, I thought Woody Allen had placed that physician there to be an ironic comment on me. Because that physician had taken care of my host, who was Anthony Forge, at that time the chair of anthropology at the Australian National University. And Anthony had recurrent sinusitis, which gave him terrible headaches, and he knew he needed to go to a doctor and receive three things. First, he needed an X-ray to see if there was an air fluid level, evidence of his infection. Second, he needed a culture, and third, to be started on an antibiotic. And he went and spent an hour and a half with this doctor, not 3 minutes, not 5 minutes, an hour and a half with this doctor, who asked him about his family background, wanted his personal narrative, and at the end, he came out with no X-ray, no culture, and no antibiotic, okay? But a great story. He had organized his life story. And that's, I would say, suffering, engagement of suffering, even as a witness, without attending to what do you do, how do you respond, is insufficient. I have a book coming out in about a month with a colleague from the UK, which looks at the origin of social science, not just anthropology, but all the social sciences, and shows that if you go back to Adam Smith, if you go back to the early 19th century British liberal thinkers who constructed the basis of social science, they had in mind not social science for the study of society for its own sake, not social science simply to understand human lives, but to improve society, to do something in the world. And as social science professionalized over time, it got away from that. It got away from that. So in the same sense that you can be overwhelmed by suffering and be let it sort of take you away from, well, how do I respond? How do I help this person? This is a human relationship. Or I want to do something for a large group in some way. So did social science move away from this. And over time, its major critics, Max Weber, Hannah Arendt, C. Wright Mills, William James, John Dewey, many others, Jane Addams, they all called it back toward knowledge in order to act in the world. Yes, witnessing to be sure, but witnessing not just to reflect back the difficult circumstance that you're in, but to do something about you and that circumstance.
I hope everybody reads this book, Arthur's new book, which I was lucky enough to get to read. That's another thing, back, Cameron, to, reading good, not reading bad. And the science, the sociology of science response, or the anthropology of science, is really important. But to your question, I just want to say here, I mean, I struggled with this enormously. And as a young physician, as a graduate student, and these are in settings of extreme poverty and a great deal of political violence in those particular years, and unfortunately on and on. So, and I just opened this and I'm thinking, what on earth is in here? This one says private and confidential. That's usually a bad sign. And this is from me. This is over 20 years ago, 6 March 1993. Dear Arthur, I'm not going to read all the first part. It says, and this, by the way, is about my promotion, which he's pushing forward at Harvard to assistant professor. That's pretty good for someone who's still an intern or a resident. I was a resident, actually. And I know this isn't insincere, but I can't believe I've never seen this. I worry that I will not be good enough in both clinical medicine and medical anthropology, which are vastly disparate undertakings. And I worry that it is my clinical competence that is seen by some as less important to this academic position. Now, I was wrong, I hope. Otherwise, Drew Faust made a big mistake promoting me to university professor. But I think it's good to worry. And what was driving my worry was the profound suffering that I was seeing, even in the Brigham, which is a big teaching hospital where I still work. People are acutely ill. I told you already I love hospital-based medicine. So I was in a lot of ICUs or in rural Haiti. And it was suffering. I thought that it was too big clearly, right? I don't know if you've ever read this again. This has been 20-something years.
I just read it before coming down here.
Is it silly?
Not at all, no.
It's
not
really
at all.
about that. It's about this, extreme suffering. And this is what I can tell you in the years since then, where I happily was chivied into coming to my senses by Arthur, particularly Arthur, that I was wrong about that in fact, you can be a much better doctor or a listener or caregiver, to use the term that we both prefer and that Arthur has elevated, much better caregiver by being, in this case I'm talking about an assistant professor. What does that mean? It means teaching, reading, discussing all the things that I just listed. And that's distance enough, I find, for me. It's distance enough from suffering. A little dose of you all, and I feel ready. Like I told you, I was commuting to West Africa, the most medically impoverished part of the world, I think, period. But that's because I feel invigorated by being around students, trainees, scholars, people who are thinking and struggling with the same kind of issues. Arthur's new book is about the struggle. He's writing about disciplines, but about his own too. That we are supposed to struggle with these problems. That's the nature of really embracing human suffering, not as a masochist or a voyeur, or all the other ways that one can look upon this, or a heartless and distant person, but you're supposed to struggle. And it's supposed to be upsetting. Again, it's a sign of sociopathy to not be repelled by suffering or repulsed by suffering. But engaging it, part of the reason we can do that is because of our engagement as teachers and scholars. Is that overly dramatic?
No, I think that's, and then you said, the astonishing thing is you said more or less the same thing then.
Did I?
Yeah.
Well, I was right then.
Let's have some other questions. Yeah. Take a mic.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for your talk. I had a question about kind of the balance of. So, if it sounds like the kind of work that both of you have done, it involves some rather big picture, call it global or call it global questions, and it involves, and part of the work that you do that informs that is about really knowing what's going on with person by person or on the ground, or so in the prisons in Russia or in a local community in Rwanda. And I was wondering how you balance those two sort of, kind of a more, sort of analytical, top-down kind of big picture sort of problem solving with the sort of bottom-up real knowledge of what the real problems are, person by person or family by family or in the communities. That sort of, and how you kind of go about, do you start with the hey, this is the problem I really want to go solve? And the example I'm thinking about is sort of, you take how, something like what the Gates Foundation is doing and some of the problems that they're working on, where they say, we want to, reduce, we want to completely get rid of, the following 3 diseases. And in order to do that, we have to reach, get a vaccine to millions of people. So we have to figure out the scale problem. But in order to do that, they have to really understand what's going on, and by person with the people who are using that. So I was curious how you think about both of those in tandem.
Well,
I think that there are so many layers to that question, and I know you've contemplated them, and I do contemplate them. And I'm going to start with the most banal, and that is, I think part of it is, well, what do you like to do? I train with Ann Becker, Jim Kim, Lawrence Cohen, and if you look at, and others, but those were my close friends and classmates and coworkers, and you look just at the 4 of those physician anthropologists, and I just remember this because it's in the letter. One really wasn't drawn to clinical medicine. Another wasn't really able to keep up, or so I thought, in anthropology, and neither was I. Right? I couldn't teach a class on kinship, nor would I be interested particularly in teaching a class on kinship. Right? I mean, I could, but I'd have to spend 3 years getting ready for it. Right? And one was just always fascinated by policy. Right? And and I was really drawn to, and am drawn to, this interpersonal interaction with patients. And so those are personal preferences, right? And I think those are not to be, for students, undergraduates, particularly, don't take up something that you are not passionate about. There's no reason to. So many people in the world have to take up things that they're not passionate about. Both my parents, for example, they didn't care. They hated their jobs. They had lousy jobs. And a lot of people, most people in the world do. So that's part of it. Another is I think a lot less pedestrian, and that is, I don't trust policymakers who don't have direct knowledge of personal experience. And that's true for health policy, and that's true for economic policy, And look at how distant economic policy that dominates development economics. It's completely experience distant. And I think that's part of the problem. It's like they don't know anybody who lives in extreme poverty, and they haven't done, again, I don't want to elevate our field too much, even though the name of this session is Why Anthropology? How many, to live for years and years with the people that you're studying, and I hope serving, is really, that's anthropology does that. Sociology should do that. Clinical medicine often does. It has a different way of living in proximity too.
But don't you think anthropology also is kind of a field that has a zoom lens built into it? It's like built into the very fabric of what anthropology is. You can go to the broad picture, you come down to the local. They go together. And I think that's one of the remarkable qualities of the field. Let's take other questions. We've got a lot, so you can move the microphone around.
Hi, my name's Montita, and I had the pleasure of taking SW25 last fall semester as a freshman. And my question is that, so Professor Kleinman, you talked a little bit about the history of social sciences and anthropology, and a lot of the history of anthropology, at least, is built upon the otherization of non-West communities, or colloquially like the white gaze. And some of those power structures, I'm sure, do still exist. And if we're students interested in engaging in work globally, how do we responsibly conduct knowledge production as an outsider of a community?
Yeah, well, that's another great question. I mean, tonight we're just filled with great questions. Every discipline looks at its own history and learns from mistakes that have been made in the past. And I think that the anthropology today is deeply informed by a critique of colonial anthropology and of Orientalism, of othering the other, of exoticism, of the T.S. Lawrence sort of approach to the world. Anthropology today is very much informed with that critique, and I think as a result, it almost starts with that premise. The question you raised is a starting premise for it, of how does it deal with this? And Paul's answer to the last question is really good. It's anything that is really valuable that's going to allow you to be creative and starts with a struggle. It starts with struggle. It starts with struggle with where did that knowledge come from? How are we making it over? And what are we applying it toward? And in doing that, you recognize that the people who were caught up in Orientalism weren't necessarily all bad people, nor was the discipline necessarily bad. The question was, how did it get caught up into that? How did a discipline that meant in its origins to get at different worlds end up radically alienating those worlds? And I think that's part of what we understand today. And the same question, by the way, could be asked of medicine. Because one of the things, Paul and I years ago taught a course on suffering.
24 years ago.
24 years ago. Actually, I was the professor, Paul was the teaching fellow, and a great professor now at Emory, Don Seaman, was the undergraduate in the course. We had more than one undergraduate, but he was one of the undergraduates. It seems to me that if you look at that struggle, that struggle to come to terms with remaking knowledge, with rethinking it, reapplying it, that is almost the basic anthropological effort. It starts with the categories. Look at the categories we start with. Do we accept those categories or do we interrogate them? And how do we interrogate them? For Paul and I, a fundamental interrogation today is the whole idea of quality. What is quality? Do we have measures of quality? I don't think I'm speaking out of turn for you, Paul. For myself, we don't think there are direct measures of quality, that all the measures that are used are either indirect or are so socially constructed as to support the neoliberal state and the economization of measures. So that, for example, we just did this in SW25 in a brilliant lecture that Paul gave, in which he showed that price, fluctuating price, was used as cost and cost benefit without taking into account the whole idea of what is cost. Does cost have to be what it is? Can it be changed, etc.? And so you could do the same thing with benefit. Benefit whom? That kind of interrogation is not being done by health policy experts. Okay? It's done by anthropologists and other interpretive social scientists and humanists. It's one of the ways I think that we precede. So the fact that past has been problematized. Take medicine. In our field, actually, if you look at the history of the Holocaust, you will discover that biomedicine and biomedical practitioners led the way to the Holocaust. That is, the initial steps in killing the enemies of the state, the Jews, the Gypsies, the Russian and Polish prisoners. The initial steps were physicians killing their patients on behalf of what was a terribly perverse ideology that killing was healing, that you were removing people who were slowing society down. And so psychiatrists figured out ways of killing the psychiatrically ill. Pediatricians figured out ways in Nazi Germany of killing the disabled children. Those steps actually led directly to the development of Zyklon B, the gases that were put into the gas chambers to kill on an industrial level. Medicine was central to this. For the Nazis, only doctors were allowed to be on at the exits when trains opened up and people poured out into the death camps. Only doctors were allowed to make the selection as to who lives and who dies, who goes immediately to be gassed, who goes to the work until you drop concentration camp. All that was medicalized. And indeed, just to show you how perverse this was and how you had to get to see how biomedicine could become perverse, the Nazis actually believed in what they call romantic medicine. They thought Jewish medicine was mechanized, impersonalized medicine. They wanted a humanistic medicine. All these terms we use, holistic medicine. Those were came out of the Nazi era. They were enthused by the idea that medicine could be holistic, etc. They were into organic treatments and organic foods long before anybody else. Now that's an incredible perversion, and an appalling perversion. And in dealing with medicine today, it's important not to forget that medicine can be abused, can be misused. And I think that's part of I would say, an anthropological or a humanistic interrogation of the subject. Respond to that, Paul?
I'm just thinking of other examples. That's what we do. Colonial medicine is full of stories of less horrifying proportion, but similar. The Pasteurians in West Africa I've been reading about, or what Salman talked about in class last year. I don't know if this year, I don't know if he did last year. He added a detail to in discussing South Africa that his great-grandfather was diagnosed with the plague, I think it was the plague, and put to death in South Africa.
Yeah.
And there's many, many stories like that and again, completely forgotten. In fact, if I may be permitted this question of historical memory or re-socializing our understanding of medicine, science, engineering, you name it. Obviously, we're getting at eugenics here, but everything that unnerved me about the Ebola response, the punitive measures, quarantine when it wasn't warranted, travel restrictions, restrictions on population movements in general, and worst of all, the isolation and quarantine of critically ill people in places where care was not possible. And this is by friends and, again, back to Mike's question, this is by people, setting policy. So that, do you recognize the acronym ETU, Ebola Treatment Unit? There wasn't a lot of T in the ETU, right? And I lost 2 friends that way because they were both physicians. So they joined the suffering of the poor who they were serving as physicians by having no access to the kind of clinical care that everyone merited, but one of them was the region's only specialist in Ebola. And he died like a dog, And again, and then you look back at history, and it's the same thing with influenza, smallpox. It's this justification of measures that don't have a lot of justification. But again, the thing that Arthur's bringing up is it's important to remember them, and that just doesn't happen a lot in everyday practice.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, like 10 more, 20 more. I don't care.
We have a great reception afterward here. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Ben. I'm in SW25 as well this year, and
Tell me
so
you love it.
It's great. No, it really is. It's honestly been life-changing for me, and I'm just a freshman, so I'm really excited for the next 3.5 years. But it's interesting because in an academic setting, especially in a place like Harvard, it's easy for us to talk about cultural humility.
It is? I haven't heard a lot of talk, and I've been here for 30-something years. And by the way, the class we taught was 29 years ago. I just did the math. I didn't mean to interrupt, but I think it is easy, but how many times have you heard it here? How about the faculty and the grad students? It may be easy, but it's not happening yet, that conversation. But
Right.
go ahead, Ben.
So I guess maybe it's easy for us to think about talking about cultural humility and adopting a more open worldview about things. But if you look at the way that especially American society is progressing, I mean, there's a presidential candidate on a certain party who's leading polls basically with a xenophobic message. You know, certain things that are being said about, you know, not respecting other people's cultures and vast generalizations. And so many people not wanting to adopt worldviews at solving problems and looking at cultural disparities in a specific way. You know, and you both have years and decades of research and experience with this, and how have you responded to so many people trying to shut the door on looking at things in a more open context?
Well, some people are historical figures who can change the world. I think actually we're sitting next to one, to be honest with you. It's not me, it's this guy over here. And also his classmate at Harvard, Jim Kim, another historical figure. I don't see myself in that mode, and I don't see a lot of us in that mode. I think there are just some people who have the charisma and have the effectiveness to change the world. Most of us, I think, are anti-heroes at best. And by anti-heroes, I have a very specific idea in mind, that we can perturb and disturb things, and we should do that when we see things that really bother us. And we can make others understand things as we've come to understand them, and we can engage with that world. But basically, we're going to turn out just in our own small lives doing those things that matter to us, and perhaps engaging a few other people who come to see the world in a similar way. I think that's would be my answer to you, that I see my work as an educator or just my engagement with people not as changing the world, but as reflecting something human in a small space in that world that resists what the world is about. I think I may have mentioned this in SW25. There's a course taught here at Harvard by a good friend of mine who's on leave this year, Michael Pewitt, which is generally one of Harvard's largest courses. Last year it had 705 students. It's, interestingly enough, not on computer science, but on ancient Chinese ritual, okay? And Michael teaches about a tradition that is a Taoist tradition, and a very ancient one, that says that basically the world is filled with negative things, an enormous amount of negative energy and negative effects, negative relationships, and you can't win, basically. But you have the responsibility as a human being to humanize your world for a short period of time, to do what you can in your small space to bring the values that you are committed to and the vision of the world that you have into play in that world, to engage that world. Okay? In spite of the fact, in this tradition, it says that you cannot possibly maintain or sustain or actually grow that change. All it's going to do is to humanize things for a while and to make you an agent of that humanity. My own feeling is that that's good enough for me. But there's no question about the fact that medical anthropology can make some major, major effects. And this is the guy who's done it, so he should respond to that side of it.
Well, you know, it would be rather disturbing, I think, Ben, if I were to say that I agreed with Arthur's assessment of me. But I do think, first of all, both of us have said that part of what we do is to write and teach. And we only write about problems like this. That's pretty much it. I mean, human suffering, humane responses to suffering, caregiving, and understanding the social roots of distress and disease. That's the name of one of Arthur's books, 1986.
Tell Joan Gillespie's story. You remember that one?
Oh yeah, this is a great story. So Arthur's his late assistant, who was, I was a grad student back then. In fact, I used to kind of sleep in William James Hall, which is kind of disgusting since
It was true.
and I was going back and forth between the medical school, Haiti, and William James Hall. And I was very close to this woman, Joan Gillespie, who had a very gravelly voice and very Boston. And I was not the one who said this, came in and said, I wouldn't be, come on, I was your research assistant. I have to admit it was an undergraduate. Came in and said, I'm looking for one of Professor Kleinman's papers. And she said, which one? And the student said, oh, the one about suffering. And she said, honey, they're all about suffering. So this is really what we do, right? So before getting on to the list, the laundry list of perhaps immodest efforts to change hearts and minds by the gazillion, I said, you know, careful analysis, writing, I hope, plainly and openly, and teaching are part of the answer to that question. I mean, if you were to survey the thousands of students who we've taught, how many do you think would agree with the xenophobia that you described? Not too many, maybe a tiny fraction. Now, we don't need to claim responsibility for that, but we're glad to be part of it, part of a resistance that may not reach, and certainly will not reach, millions of people only through those activities. Although, for reasons brought up in response to Hannah's question, you can reach more people now than you could when I was a student. But back to that list, you know, I'm a real believer, and I think Arthur will support me now more than ever, in activism and personal engagement. Because if, you know, looking back to the horror not only of the Holocaust, but of the participation of doctors in the Holocaust, what possibly could have mitigated that? And, you know, activism against it is part of that. Organizing, and then, you know, not finally, because the list is so long of things that you could do, I think, to fight back. Part of it is just to show that, in fact, a very different approach brings you satisfaction and joy. And that's without bringing up history, which of course reminds us that we're a nation of immigrants and, you know, have expropriated this land from others, and the list goes on and on. So the argument of history is important here, but even more important, I think, is close personal engagement. One of the things that I've enjoyed doing is bringing a lot of my colleagues and students from Haiti, Rwanda, Mexico, here to be part of this global university. They are here in this room tonight, many of them, Peru, I could go on, right? And also to go there. So going back to the 15th century, as one does, Ben, you know, in a way, to quote from I think it's a Jamaican poem just after independence of Jamaica from Britain, this is colonization in reverse, right? Or this is the global political economy, the flip side of it, that has meted out so much suffering, but also has the promise to do something very uplifting and linked to human solidarity, which of course does not admit to that kind of xenophobia, whether we're talking about refugees from Syria or any other troubled and disturbed place, clearly related to the rest of the world. You know, there's a big difference between the response of Hungary and Germany, right? There's a big difference between the response of a nation that recalls that it is a nation of immigrants and one that is, you know, set on building walls to keep people out of. It's the same thing. Fortress Europe is like that too. So I think the little nugget that I'm adding here is, I don't believe in that kind of xenophobia, but I'm also happier than, than people who believe in it. My personal life is so enriched as a doctor, as a teacher, by quite the opposite of that. And I think Arthur does a lot more of it than he has said there.
I think it's time to enjoy the reception, and we'll talk in small groups, and thank you guys for coming.